When my grandparents passed, I thought I was just inheriting a home, a quiet, 5-acre patch of history they'd built with their own hands. But what they left me was something far bigger. A fight I never asked for, against people who believed power and paperwork could erase a family's legacy. Within weeks, I was facing lawsuits, threats, and a homeowners association that thought they could bury me in legal letters and intimidation. They had no idea who they were dealing with. If you've ever believed that doing the right thing still matters, or that truth can outlast corruption, this story is for you. So stick around, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in standing their ground. Because this fight began with loss, but it ended with legacy. It all started the day my grandparents died. Grief has a way of sharpening the edges of memory. The morning we buried my grandparents, I could still feel the gravel of their driveway under my shoes, hear the hinge of the gate that never quite closed, smell the tomatoes ripening in the sun beneath the kitchen window. They built that place on stubborn love and just enough money to be proud. 5 acres of soil, and a weathered house that knew our laughter and our silence. As a kid, I learned the seasons from the ground itself. Peas meant spring, corn meant summer, and the first yellowing leaf meant my grandfather would start patching the roof again. They never wanted much, only to keep what was theirs. Then the city arrived, polite, relentless, and wearing the smile of progress. One master-planned community after another crept closer, each with manicured lawns, glimmering streetlights, and brochures that promised elevated living. Paved roads stopped at our dirt lane like a border between eras. Their perfect white fences stood in neat rows. Their mailboxes matched like uniforms. We were the smudge on their postcard, the patch of stubborn earth they couldn't quite erase. Developers called, offering more than enough to tempt reason. My grandparents thanked them kindly and went back to weeding. They didn't belong to anyone's blueprint, and that was the point. When they passed, first her, then him, as if one couldn't bear to linger without the other, the property became mine, grief and duty intertwined. The barn leaned like an exhausted old man. The roof sagged from too many winters. The garden had gone wild with weeds. Still, standing there felt like standing in a heartbeat that hadn't stopped, only slowed. I promised myself I'd restore what time had bent, repaint the porch the same soft green my grandmother loved, and keep the soil turning, season after season. Isn't that what inheritance truly is? A promise to continue what mattered most. 2 weeks after the funeral, a certified letter arrived, its envelope thick and self-important. The return address wasn't a name I recognized, but a law firm representing the local homeowners association. Inside, the language was precise and cold. They accused me of owing years of unpaid dues, of harboring unapproved structures, of violating landscaping codes. They listed numbers with more zeros than decency, threatened foreclosure, and demanded immediate remedy. I read it twice, then again, each time feeling a strange blend of disbelief and insult. It wasn't a welcome. It was a declaration of war, written in legalese. Here's what they didn't expect: that I'd ask the one question their entire argument couldn't survive. How can you owe dues to a club you never joined, whose borders never crossed your fence? Our property had never been part of their association. My grandfather kept meticulous files, deeds, surveys, even the original rejection letters from developers. Yet, in that moment, certainty felt fragile against the weight of official stationery. That's how intimidation works. It dresses up in confidence and waits for silence. Have you noticed how a stamped letter can make you question what you already know is right? I called the number printed at the bottom. The lawyer's voice was smooth, like someone reading from a script they'd performed 100 times. He said the association had been lenient while my grandparents were alive, but now expected compliance. He threw around words like jurisdiction and implied consent, as if the vocabulary alone could bend reality. When I asked for proof, he told me fighting would be expensive, and he paused here. Unwise. The tone was familiar, that practiced authority that mistakes fear for reason. Maybe you've been there yourself, half grieving, half doubting your own ground, wondering if it's safer to surrender simply because the letterhead looks official. That's the quiet power of intimidation. It trades on exhaustion, but contrast is a teacher. On one side stood the garden my grandparents planted to feed a family. On the other, a threat dressed in professionalism. Which story should win? The one you choose to believe. I remembered my grandfather's calm no. The kind that didn't need to shout to be final. I remembered my grandmother's eyes when she set dinner down. Steady, unflinching, certain. So I asked myself the real question. What does this land deserve from me? Not panic, not anger, stewardship. The kind that reads every line, asks better questions, refuses to be hurried into submission. Fear wants you small. Legacy asks you to stand taller. I took a slow breath, folded the letter, and placed it beside the deeds my grandparents had protected like scripture. That day, I stopped seeing the fight as an interruption and started seeing it as a continuation. If they wanted to test what this land meant to me, they were about to learn. Inheritance doesn't just pass property, it passes resolve. The next morning, I stared at that letter again. The seal, the phrasing, the quiet confidence of its threats. It was all designed to make you feel smaller. There's a particular arrogance to legal language, a way it turns ordinary people into trespassers on their own land. Still, curiosity cut through the fear. I wanted to hear the voice behind the words. So, I called. The receptionist transferred me, and after a click and a silence long enough to make me question the decision, a man answered. His voice carried that polished smoothness only years of billing by the hour can create. He introduced himself, though the tone made it sound like he was doing me a favor. When I said my name, there was a pause, a slow exhale, and then he spoke, as if the case was already closed. He said, "You've inherited property that's always been part of the Ascent Estates covenant. Your grandparents were informally exempted, but that courtesy expired with their passing." The words "expired with their passing" made me tighten my grip on the phone. It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he said it, as though my grandparents' lives were merely a temporary legal inconvenience. He went on, describing membership responsibilities and failure to comply. Each phrase dropped like a gavel, impersonal and heavy. Then came the real threat. Daily fines, accumulating legal fees, and the possibility of a lien that could, in his words, sever your financial stability. I asked him where in the deed it stated any of this. His tone sharpened, a predator showing teeth. "If you intend to fight, be aware that the HOA board and I are prepared to escalate. Litigation isn't cheap." He said, litigation, the way a magician says abracadabra, as if the mere sound of it could make my courage disappear. And yet, beneath the smug assurance, I could sense something. Habit. This was a man used to people folding. He didn't argue law. He argued fear. That realization was small but powerful. After hanging up, I sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of people who'd never once bent to intimidation. I thought about my grandfather facing down developers decades earlier, armed with nothing but a handshake ethic and a firm no. That same stubbornness ran through me now. But the rules had changed. The game wasn't played on soil anymore. It was played on paper, and the currency was confusion. So I did what felt most logical. I found my own lawyer. The property attorney's office was tucked between an insurance agency and a nail salon, a reminder that not all battles start in courtrooms. Some begin beside strip mall parking lots. He was older, with a voice that carried more patience than pretense. I laid out the documents, the letter, the history. He read silently for a while, the kind of silence that measures weight before deciding where to lift. When he finally spoke, he didn't offer comfort. He offered context. "You're standing in what we call a gray zone," he said. Decades ago, developers sometimes filed covenants that mentioned optional participation. Some families joined, others didn't. Over time, the language blurred. Associations later pretended optional meant inevitable. The word pretended lingered in the air. Pretending is easy when you have authority on your side. He explained that fighting would mean dissecting old deeds, challenging interpretations, possibly appealing county records. It could take years and cost tens of thousands, all while fines accumulated. "They're betting on fatigue," he said. "Most people just pay." It was an honest assessment, and that honesty carried more sting than the threats. Because in that moment, I saw the strategy clearly. They didn't need to be right. They just needed me exhausted. Have you ever noticed how fear doesn't always shout? Sometimes it whispers practicalities. How much you can afford, how long you can wait, how many hours of sleep you're willing to lose. Fear dresses itself as reason. And yet, sitting there, reason started to look suspiciously like surrender. My lawyer wasn't wrong. He was pragmatic. But pragmatism has a cousin named resignation, and I wasn't ready to meet it. Driving home, the contrast between the two worlds pressed harder than ever. On one side of the street, identical houses gleamed behind HOA-approved shrubs, identical smiles hiding identical anxieties. On the other side, my grandparents' land sat raw, imperfect, and real, a memory refusing to conform. I realized this wasn't just about property. It was about identity. When you inherit something born from defiance, how do you justify folding just because the battlefield looks different? That night, I reread the deed under the same lamp my grandfather used for his crossword puzzles. The language was dense but familiar now, like a code waiting to be cracked. Words like optional, adjacent, non-participatory easement. None of it matched the lawyer's confidence. It was all conditional, dependent, uncertain. In other words, defensible. I started marking passages, cross-referencing with public filings. Every ambiguous phrase became a potential thread to pull. Confusion had been their weapon. Maybe it could become mine. Still, doubt crept in. What if I was wrong? What if this gray area swallowed me whole? But then I remembered something my grandmother once said while pruning roses. "You can't negotiate with weeds. You pull them or they take the garden." Her wisdom wasn't about horticulture. It was about boundaries. If I let them redefine mine, they'd own not just the property, but the principle. The next day, I called the HOA lawyer again, not for answers, but for insight. I asked him to send the specific clause he was referencing. His sigh was theatrical. "I don't have time to educate you on property law," he said. That sentence told me more than any document ever could. People who are right don't avoid sunlight. They welcome it. Bullies, however, prefer shadows. When I hung up, something shifted. Fear didn't vanish, but it lost its authority. I realized the difference between intimidation and power. One depends on your belief in it. They wanted compliance, not confrontation. And I wasn't going to give them either. Not yet. I drafted a short reply, formal but calm, requesting all relevant documentation for their claims. No anger, no defensiveness, just curiosity with teeth. Because that's the part bullies misunderstand. Quiet isn't weakness. It's focus, the kind that studies before it strikes. Somewhere between grief and defiance, I'd stumbled into a new kind of inheritance. Not land, not property, but resolve. They wanted me uncertain. Instead, they'd just given me purpose. For a few days, I walked around in a fog of disbelief. The lawyer's threats replayed in my head like a loop I couldn't escape. Legal fees, fines, foreclosure. It was strange how quickly fear could shrink the world. Tasks that once felt simple, feeding the chickens, fixing a broken hinge, now carried the weight of uncertainty. Every creak of the porch reminded me that someone, somewhere, was waiting for me to give up. I felt like a guest in my own inheritance, an imposter in the very place that held my family's history. But fear, if you let it linger too long, starts to look like surrender. And that's when my wife said something that cut through the noise completely. She looked up from the letter, calm and steady, and said, "If they want to play legal hardball, then we'll play smarter. Not louder, not angrier, smarter." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward. It reframed everything. What if the goal wasn't to fight on their terms, but to understand the battlefield better than they did? What if power came not from force, but from clarity? That shift, tiny but seismic, was the moment we stopped reacting and started planning. We pulled the old filing boxes out from under the stairs, the ones labeled property records in my grandfather's precise handwriting. They smelled faintly of dust and engine oil, like time preserved. Inside were decades of deeds, permits, letters from surveyors, and notes written in the margins by a man who had spent his life defending every square foot of this land. I realized then that I wasn't starting a new fight. I was stepping into one that had already been fought quietly for years. My grandparents hadn't just built a home. They had left behind a roadmap. We just had to learn how to read it. Every evening after work, my wife and I spread papers across the dining table like detectives piecing together a mystery. She handled the organization, dates, signatures, references, while I traced connections between legal clauses and land plots. The HOA's claim that our property always fell under the covenant started to crumble the more we looked. For one, the boundaries described in their filings stopped short of our property line by several feet. The maps they submitted to the county were amended years after the fact, sometimes without signatures, sometimes with signatures that didn't match. Each discovery peeled back another layer of manipulation, and with it, another layer of fear. There's something empowering about replacing confusion with comprehension. Every contradiction we found was a small victory, a reminder that authority isn't the same as accuracy. The deeper we went, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA had been quietly expanding its influence over the years, folding in nearby properties through a mix of intimidation and administrative loopholes. But here's the irony: bureaucracy leaves footprints. Every forged claim, every rushed amendment, every meeting that wasn't properly recorded. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. We just had to slow down enough to see it. Sometimes, late at night, when my eyes blurred from reading tiny type, I'd glance at my wife across the table and feel something stronger than exhaustion: admiration. She was meticulous, relentless, unshaken. It reminded me that power doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like quiet persistence, like a steady hand turning page after page, unwilling to stop until the truth stands naked. Have you ever noticed that confidence returns not all at once, but piece by piece, each time you refuse to back down? That's what was happening. Fear hadn't left, but it had changed shape. It wasn't a master anymore. It was motivation. We began to cross-reference public records from the county clerk's office. That's when things got truly strange. A series of bylaw amendments had been filed 6 years earlier. Documents that expanded HOA authority to properties within adjacent easement zones. But those amendments weren't signed by the full board. The notary stamps didn't match the filing dates. And worse, the county register showed no public notice ever being issued. In other words, they'd quietly rewritten their own rules in the dark. What had started as a lawsuit now looked more like a cover-up. That realization changed our mindset entirely. This wasn't about us being unfairly targeted. It was about them protecting a lie that had been profitable for years. The game wasn't about dues or fences, it was about control. And once you understand a bully's motive, their power starts to dissolve. I could feel the shift inside me. From the panicked air to something sharper, calmer, more deliberate. I wasn't just defending a house anymore. I was defending truth itself, the kind that resists revision. By the end of that week, the kitchen table looked less like a workspace and more like a war room. Highlighters marked timelines, sticky notes labeled every inconsistency, and our printer hummed late into the night as we made copies of everything. It was tedious, unglamorous work, but it felt like reclaiming ground. The same ground my grandparents had once defended with grit and silence. We were now defending with facts and patience. That's how transformation begins. Not in grand gestures, but in small decisions made consistently. To study instead of panic. To question instead of assume. To replace fear with focus. Somewhere between the legal jargon and the property lines, we rediscovered our footing. We weren't victims anymore. We were investigators, and that subtle shift, from being hunted to hunting the truth, was the moment the balance of power began to tilt. There's a fine line between submission and strategy. At first glance, what we did next probably looked like surrender. We decided to comply, or at least, that's what we wanted them to think. The trick with power structures is this. When you fight them head-on, they dig in. But when you bow slightly, they relax. And that's when you start rearranging the game board. So, we sent a partial payment. Just enough to look cooperative, not enough to end the conflict. We included a polite note requesting a copy of the association's bylaws, financial statements, and meeting minutes. It was phrased with the kind of formal politeness that makes bureaucrats underestimate you. They saw naivete. What we were really doing was opening a door they didn't realize existed. The response came quickly. A curt email acknowledging receipt and attaching a 350-page PDF filled with dense language that only a lawyer could love. But buried in the contradictions and vague clauses were keys to their undoing. They had written themselves into so many corners that compliance itself could become a weapon. My wife and I printed every page, highlighting terms that contradicted each other. It felt almost absurd. Two people at a kitchen table using dollar store highlighters to outthink a network of lawyers and board members who'd built an empire of intimidation. But that's the quiet beauty of malicious compliance. It doesn't shout. It waits. We started small. The bylaws required members in good standing to maintain fences that match community standards. So, we filed an application for a fence repair, complete with detailed sketches, neutral color samples, and citations from their own rulebook. It was so by the book that it practically squeaked. A week later, we received approval. Likely rubber-stamped without a glance. They assumed we'd replace a few panels. Instead, We scheduled the construction of an entire 6-foot-tall cedar privacy wall around the property. Perfectly compliant, perfectly devastating to their aesthetic. The day construction began, you could feel the collective gasp ripple through the neighborhood. Trucks rolled in, workers unloaded panels, and by sunset, a new border rose. A wooden monument to irony. The neighbors who once peeked over their patios now stared at a solid wall that cut off their view of the open field they'd come to treat like a shared amenity. By the third day, the HOA president called. Her tone balanced somewhere between fury and disbelief. She demanded we stop, insisting that community harmony depended on open sightlines. I simply read back the clause number and reminded her of the committee's written approval. For once, silence was my ally. That silence, the kind that follows when bullies realize they've been outmaneuvered, was delicious. From that moment on, every letter from them became an opportunity. They fined us $50 for leaving a trash bin visible for 10 minutes. We paid with a check and attached a request for clarification on container concealment standards. They accused us of noxious weeds. We submitted photographs showing neatly trimmed grass and asked for a copy of the inspection log. Each interaction forced them to acknowledge their own inefficiency, their contradictions, their lack of consistency. It wasn't defiance, it was obedience turned inside out. The more they pushed, the more transparent their arrogance became. One email from the HOA's attorney claimed that our compliance was in bad faith. I almost laughed. Bad faith from people who had manufactured a lawsuit over property lines they couldn't prove they owned. It was a textbook example of projection. Still, I didn't reply with anger. Instead, I thanked him for his diligence and requested copies of any prior cases supporting his position. The tone was professional, surgical, and that's the thing. They couldn't fight politeness. They thrived on resistance, not reason. When resistance turned into precise paperwork, they had nowhere to swing. Meanwhile, my wife kept digging through the financial disclosures. Her eye for detail made her dangerous. She noticed something strange: monthly payments labeled beautification services. $20,000 every single month, paid to a company called Carr's Beautiful Borders. The name alone was suspicious, but what caught our attention was the address. The same street as the HOA president. A quick public record search confirmed it. The company was registered under her name. The woman enforcing fines over trash bins was quietly billing the community $250,000 a year for landscaping that didn't exist. We didn't confront her. Not yet. That's the thing about discovery. You don't announce it. You build around it. We started gathering proof, copies of checks, timestamps of maintenance logs, photos showing contractors that never appeared. Every inconsistency became a brick in the wall we were quietly building. The same kind of wall that now surrounded our home, both literal and metaphorical. What began as defense was slowly turning into offense. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself smiling at the absurdity of it all. We weren't hackers or detectives. We were just two ordinary people using patience as leverage. But there was satisfaction in it. The slow reversal of gravity, the HOA, once confident in its dominance, now tripped over its own procedures. Every form we filed, every payment we mailed, every recorded request became part of a trail that led straight back to their corruption. And the best part? They didn't even realize it. They believed we were meekly falling in line, when in truth, we were tightening the noose they'd woven for themselves. The tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. Homeowners who once looked away began to whisper. They'd seen the fence. They'd heard the shouting phone calls. Some even stopped by, quietly asking what was really going on. I didn't say much, only that it was handled. The less I said, the more they speculated. Power doesn't always need publicity. Sometimes mystery does the work for you. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Through all of it, I kept thinking about my grandparents. How many times must they have faced smaller versions of this same arrogance? City inspectors, developers, opportunists, each convinced they could outmaneuver an old couple with calloused hands and quiet conviction. They had fought with willpower. We fought with paper. Different weapons, same war. Every document filed felt like paying homage to their defiance. By the end of that month, the balance had shifted completely. The HOA still believed it was in control, but control had quietly left their hands. They didn't realize that compliance could be sharper than rebellion, that politeness could sting worse than protest. What they saw as submission was, in truth, strategy in motion. We were playing by their rules, word for word, clause for clause. But we were the only ones actually following them. And the deeper they leaned into their own authority, the closer they came to exposing just how fragile it really was. There's a strange kind of silence that settles in when you know something's wrong but can't yet prove it. It's not the silence of peace. It's the silence before a storm. For weeks, we'd been politely pestering the HOA for access to their records, citing bylaws that allowed any member in good standing to review financial statements. They stalled, redirected, and pretended to misunderstand. The more they resisted, the more certain I became that they had something to hide. Eventually, perhaps out of arrogance or exhaustion, they relented. A link appeared in my inbox one morning. A digital dump of thousands of pages, poorly scanned and chaotically named. It was supposed to overwhelm us. Instead, it lit a fire. The first night, we brewed coffee and spread out the files like treasure maps. Each document smelled faintly of opportunity, receipts, contracts, meeting notes, each one a fragment of a larger story they didn't expect anyone to read. My wife, ever the patient one, began sorting transactions by vendor, highlighting patterns. I focused on meeting minutes and signatures, trying to trace the decision-making chain. It was slow, tedious work, but there was power in the tedium. When you've been bullied long enough, even monotony becomes a form of defiance. Every hour spent decoding those pages was an act of resistance, a quiet, meticulous rebellion against the illusion of authority. It didn't take long to notice that the numbers didn't add up. The landscaping budget, for instance, had tripled in the last 2 years with no visible improvements. The same vendor name, Carr's Beautiful Borders, appeared over and over again. Payments were made monthly, always round numbers, always approved without recorded votes. It wasn't incompetence, it was precision, the kind of precision that hides theft behind bureaucracy. My wife looked up from her laptop and said, "You realize this company doesn't even exist in the business registry, right?" Her tone was calm, but her eyes held the spark of someone who'd just found the first thread in a web. That discovery changed everything. We cross-referenced the company's mailing address with public property records. The address belonged to none other than the HOA president herself. The woman who'd fined us for a trash bin was quietly funneling nearly $250,000 a year into her own account under the guise of landscaping contracts. Every dollar came from the pockets of her neighbors, the same people she scolded for unapproved paint colors and misaligned mailboxes. It was theft dressed up as management. And the lawyer? He wasn't innocent either. His invoices showed consultation retainers, double the market rate, approved without documentation, signed by the same 3 board members each time. It wasn't just greed, it was collusion. But corruption rarely hides in plain sight. It hides behind complexity. The deeper we dug, The more layers we found: board dinners charged to the HOA card, gasoline receipts from out-of-state trips labeled as property inspections, a $6,000 charge for community improvement materials that turned out to be high-end patio furniture on someone's private deck. Each discovery sparked both outrage and clarity. The narrative was writing itself. Power unchecked becomes parasitic. And yet, as satisfying as it was to uncover their deceit, something still felt incomplete, like a puzzle with one corner missing. Then came the night everything snapped into focus. My wife was combing through property deeds for adjacent lots, trying to understand when the HOA's authority had expanded. Her voice broke the quiet around midnight. "You need to see this," she said. I leaned over her shoulder, and there it was, an oversight so monumental it almost seemed impossible. The HOA's original charter had been recorded in phases when the development was first built. Phase 1 included the founding members, the initial board. But whoever filed the documents decades ago had made a clerical error. The covenants, the legal backbone that binds properties to the association, were never properly attached to the first phase, meaning every home in that section, including the presidents, the treasurers, and the secretaries, wasn't legally part of the HOA at all. They had no authority to govern, no right to collect dues, no standing to enforce anything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what we were looking at was immense. It was like finding the loose brick in a fortress wall, the one that, if removed, brings everything crashing down. I reread the filings, cross-checked the parcel IDs, even pulled county plat maps just to be sure. It all lined up perfectly. The HOA had been operating for years on a foundation that didn't exist. Every fine, every lawsuit, every letter. They were all built on sand. The same people who had weaponized legal language against everyone else weren't even subject to the rules they enforced. The irony was almost poetic. The president, who prided herself on order and control, had been presiding over chaos. The lawyer who threatened me with liens had been defending ghosts, and the neighbors who feared speaking up had been bullied by a government that wasn't legally real. It was the ultimate reversal, authority collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. I remember feeling a strange mix of triumph and disbelief. Triumph because we finally had proof. Disbelief because the truth was so simple it almost felt absurd. How had no one noticed? The answer, of course, was fear. Fear keeps people from asking questions that matter. We didn't rush to act. That's the thing about power. You don't announce when you've taken it back. You let the realization simmer, grow roots. We began organizing the evidence, creating a timeline of decisions, payments, and legal filings. Each document had a place, each name a pattern. I even color-coded the violations: blue for financial fraud, red for procedural errors, yellow for governance breaches. By the time we finished, the wall behind our dining table looked like the headquarters of a quiet revolution. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about restoring balance to something that had long been tilted toward intimidation. Still, the satisfaction was tempered by a deeper awareness. Corruption like this doesn't just happen. It's allowed. It thrives in apathy, in the belief that someone else will notice, someone else will speak up. And that's the most dangerous illusion of all. My wife and I weren't special. We were simply unwilling to look away. That's the subtle shift that changes everything. The moment you realize truth isn't given, it's earned. But even with the proof in our hands, we knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real confrontation. Exposing them would require precision. One wrong step, and they'd bury us in countersuits or smear campaigns. Yet, the thought didn't scare me anymore. Once you've seen the rot beneath the surface, fear loses its edge. Because now, the question isn't if you'll act, it's when. And that's where we were, standing at the edge of revelation, holding evidence so explosive it could unravel everything they'd built. We didn't celebrate. We didn't even speak for a long time. We just sat there, the glow of the computer screen washing over us, feeling the gravity of the moment settle in. Justice wasn't a dream anymore. It was a plan forming quietly in the dark. And as the night stretched on, I found myself thinking of my grandparents again. How they'd stood their ground without ever needing to shout. Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not land or money or memories, but the courage to see what others ignore, and the will to fight for what's right, no matter how long it takes. Calling the meeting felt like lighting a match in a room full of gas fumes. For weeks, we'd been gathering documents, signatures, and support from the few homeowners still brave enough to question the board. The bylaws allowed any member to request a special meeting with 10% of signatures, and we had nearly double that. When the notice went out, silence fell over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. People didn't talk about it openly, but you could feel the energy. Something long buried was about to break the surface. The night of the meeting, the community hall filled faster than I expected. Folding chairs scraped against tile as neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering, "At the front sat the board." 3 people who had ruled this place like petty monarchs. And beside them, the lawyer who'd tried to scare me into silence. They looked confident, almost bored. That was their mistake. Power makes people comfortable right before it disappears. I walked to the front, feeling the weight of every page of evidence in my hands. My wife sat in the front row, calm and steady, a silent anchor in a room vibrating with tension. I started slowly, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging that we all wanted the same thing, a community run with honesty. Then I opened the binder. "Tonight," I said, "we're going to talk about where our money has gone and who's been spending it." You could hear a chair creak somewhere in the back, and then nothing but breathing. I began with the landscaping contracts, $20,000 a month paid to a company that didn't exist outside a mailing address belonging to our HOA president. I projected copies of the invoices onto a screen, side by side with the business registration documents showing her as the sole owner. There was a sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the back. I didn't rush. I let the silence do the work. Then I moved to the lawyer's invoices, double-billed retainers, consultation fees for services never recorded. Every example followed the same pattern. Their signatures, our money. The president tried to interrupt, claiming I was misinterpreting the data. Her voice, once sharp with authority, now trembled. "You don't understand how HOA operations work," she said. I didn't argue. I simply read her own bylaw aloud. Article 8, Section 2. Board members shall not engage in self-dealing or hold contracts without competitive bidding and full disclosure. Then I pointed at the signature under the contract and said, "That's yours." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in murmurs of disbelief and anger. The air was heavy with something that had been missing for years. Accountability. The lawyer stood up next, voice slick with arrogance. "This is defamation," he said, scanning the crowd as if expecting fear. "You're spreading lies in a public forum. I advise everyone here to remember that legal consequences—" He didn't finish. A woman from the back, one of the quieter neighbors, cut him off. "We're tired of the threats," she said. Applause followed, not loud, but growing, like a fuse burning toward something inevitable. That was the moment everything shifted. The board had thrived because everyone was afraid to speak. But fear can't survive once people start clapping for courage. I turned the page and revealed the final piece. The county filings, the deeds from Phase 1 of the development, showing that the covenants binding our properties to the HOA had never been properly recorded. I held them up next to deeds from later phases, where the covenants clearly appeared. According to public record, I said, these signatures are missing the legal attachments that create HOA jurisdiction, which means, I paused, letting the words land, this board never had the authority to govern at all. The room erupted again, this time with voices overlapping, people turning to one another, demanding answers. The board members exchanged panicked glances. The president tried to shout over the crowd, insisting it was a clerical error. But the damage was done. The illusion had cracked. For years, their power had been absolute because it went unquestioned. Now, with proof laid bare, they were just neighbors who'd stolen from their own. When the noise settled, I invoked Article 3, Section 1. The clause stating that all board members must be active members of the association. Since the covenants never applied to Phase 1, I said, none of you are legally members. Therefore, under this bylaw, your seats are vacated effective immediately. The words hung there like thunder. Then, slowly, people began to stand. One by one, homeowners raised their hands in support. The vote wasn't even close. The board was removed on the spot. The lawyer tried to gather his papers, muttering about lawsuits that would never come. The president refused to look at anyone. Her certainty had vanished, replaced by the hollow awareness that the empire she'd built on lies had collapsed in a single evening. My wife leaned toward me and whispered, "It's over." But I knew it wasn't. This was just the reckoning before the resolution. In the days that followed, the county clerk confirmed everything. The missing covenants were real. The HOA's legal foundation had never been properly recorded. Their authority was a ghost story built on bad paperwork. The homeowners, once divided, began working together to clean up the mess. For the first time, meetings were about real issues: repairs, safety, community, no threats, no fines, no fear. Looking back, that night wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about reminding people of their power, the kind that can't be written in bylaws or buried under bureaucracy. We didn't just win a legal battle, we reclaimed a sense of ownership over our own lives. And maybe that's the deeper truth about justice. It doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with one person standing up and saying, quietly but firmly, "Enough." After the meeting, it felt like the whole neighborhood exhaled at once. Years of tension and whispered complaints dissolved into something that almost felt like relief. The county confirmed what we already knew. The covenants for Phase 1 had never been filed. Legally, the board had no authority to govern anyone. Their reign had ended not with shouting or lawsuits, but with proof. It was strange, watching people who once ruled with arrogance suddenly reduced to paperwork and fines. The HOA president was charged with financial misconduct, ordered to repay the money she'd siphoned, and permanently banned from holding any leadership position in community organizations. The lawyer who'd threatened to destroy us faced a disciplinary hearing that ended in disbarment. Every story needs an ending, and theirs came quietly, wrapped not in drama, but in justice. But the real change wasn't in courtrooms or documents. It was in people. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact began stopping by with coffee, wanting to know more about what had really happened. At first, they were cautious, embarrassed even, realizing how easily they'd believed the narrative spun by those in power. Over time, the embarrassment turned into gratitude. Together, we decided what came next. Without the board, the HOA couldn't legally function. We voted to dissolve it entirely, returning each property to individual ownership. No more fines, no more threats, just people managing their own lives again. The motion passed almost unanimously. Freedom, it turned out, didn't need management. It needed trust. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was almost poetic. The endless warning letters stopped. The mailbox, once a symbol of anxiety, became ordinary again. The neighborhood started to breathe. People began to plant gardens, repaint fences, host barbecues. The quiet cul-de-sac that had felt sterile under the HOA's gaze slowly came back to life. It's funny how fear steals community faster than neglect ever could. Once the fear was gone, connection took its place. Even the neighbors who'd once complained about my grandfather's eyesore barn came over to help me repair it. The structure that had once divided us became a project that brought us together. One evening I stood outside as the sun sank behind the cedar fence we'd built. The same one that had caused such outrage, ivy had started climbing its panels, softening its edges. On the other side, laughter drifted through from a backyard gathering. For the first time, there was peace, not silence. There's a difference. Silence hides things. Peace lets them rest. I thought about my grandparents then, about how they'd fought to keep this land free from the kind of control that always disguises itself as community. In a way, we had just fought the same battle, only in a different language. They used grit and patience. We used paper and persistence. But the spirit was the same, refusing to bow to what isn't right, no matter how official it sounds. Justice stories often end with victory, but this one ended with understanding. Power only lasts as long as people believe in it. The board had been powerful because no one questioned them. Once we did, the illusion vanished. That's something I carry with me now. How easy it is to mistake confidence for truth, and how vital it is to ask questions, even when your voice shakes. Especially then. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what my grandparents would say if they could see the place now. The garden's been replanted. The same patch where my grandmother once grew tomatoes now bursts with new life. The barn stands straight again, painted the same soft gray my grandfather favored, and where weeds once covered the path, wildflowers now bloom in the cracks. It's not perfect, but it's alive. It's honest. On quiet mornings, I sit on the porch with coffee, watching sunlight slide across the yard. I think about how grief once filled this house and how slowly it transformed into gratitude. This fight wasn't just about property lines or legal clauses. It was about legacy, about proving that integrity doesn't fade with generations. My grandparents taught me that independence isn't isolation. It's self-respect. That real freedom isn't loud. It's steady, patient, and rooted in knowing what's yours to protect. We won, yes, but more than that, we endured. And in enduring, we became something our grandparents would recognize. Stubbornly hopeful, quietly defiant, fiercely proud of what's been built by hand and defended by heart. The land feels different now, not because it changed, but because we did. The fight didn't just free the property, it freed the people who called it home. As the wind moves through the garden and the cedar fence creaks in the evening light, I realize something simple but powerful. Some inherit money, others inherit memories, but the rarest inheritance of all is conviction, the kind that outlives you. My grandparents' legacy wasn't the house or the acres. It was the lesson that no amount of paperwork or power can replace the right to stand your ground. And now, long after they're gone, their spirit still lives here, in every blade of grass, every repaired board, and every quiet moment of peace that follows a long, hard fight.